Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 164th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And this month's theme is that of UK Black History Month, Action, Not Words. So on today's episode, I'm going to be reflecting on the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X Kendi, published in the UK in 2019. I first listened to this book on audio, which is extra special because Professor Ibram X Kendi reads it himself in 2020 and subsequently bought the book. The book has helped me not only personally, but professionally digest and process the complexities of racism and anti-Blackness specifically. And if you've read the book and it resonates with you, I'd love to hear from you as a listener. So why not connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn? I'm at Diverse Minds UK, and there's also a special Instagram podcast page. I'd love to see you there and hear your thoughts. So I followed Ibram X Kendi's work for some time, and he's actually a contemporary of mine. In fact, I found out that our birthdays are the same year and just 2 days apart. And I really wish I'd known him as a child living in the US. Of course, I lived in a completely different part, but I feel this book is poignant in so many ways, as just over 2 years after the June 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, it seems many people's enthusiasm has waned, and I seem to be asked the same questions over and over again. And my colleague and friend, Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey, if you don't know him, he runs Element of Inclusion and has a corresponding podcast, so do check it out, talks about this book being a work of art, and I couldn't agree more. I do feel that there is a sense of fatigue and exhaustion for many people and the current rhetoric about anti-wokeness when it comes to racism and anti-racism. And what this book does is it delves into the subtleties and the nuances and the ways in which most countries we are entrenched in some form of superiority and superior race ideology. So I wanted to read a tiny bit of a paragraph actually from the introduction and what this book is about, because I couldn't really summarize it as eloquently as it's written in the book. So the other thing to say is this book is again from an African-American / US context. So a lot of the history is US based, but what he does as a writer is does explain things in terms of historical context and does touch on other countries within it. But here are 2 paragraphs from the book credited to Ibram X Kendi that I wanted to read. So this book is ultimately about the basic struggle we're all in, the struggle to be fully human and to see that others are fully human. I share my own journey of being raised in the dueling racial consciousness of the Reagan-era Black middle class, then right, turning onto the 10-lane highway of anti-Black racism, a highway mysteriously free of police and free on gas, and veering off onto the 2-lane highway of anti-white racism, where gas is rare and police are everywhere, before finding and turning down the unlit dirt road of anti-racism. After taking this grueling journey to the dirt road of anti-racism, humanity can come upon the clearing of a potential future, an anti-racist world in all its imperfect beauty. It can become real if we focus on power instead of people, if we focus on changing policy instead of groups of people. It's possible if we overcome our cynicism about the permanence of racism. We know how to be racist. We know how to pretend to be not racist. Now let's know how to be anti-racist. So this is incredibly poignant. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about this book was the weaving of history, context, personal anecdotes, and the richness that it brings. And in organizations, people, whatever level they are, seem to get very stuck and focus on fixing practical things like recruitment and the numbers. But in order to address racism and become anti-racist, we have to embrace discomfort. I'm also applying this to myself in terms of unlearning certain behaviors and things that have been internalized for me. And in my recent TED Talk on the connection between race, culture, and mental health in the workplace, I talk about this idea of discomfort. And I mentioned this idea that individually, we have to all embrace discomfort and acknowledge our feelings, including uncertainty and guilt. And one of the ways is to experience these emotions in our bodies, which will encompass physical sensations as well as the emotional ones that we might feel. Secondly, thinking about this institutionally. So not being afraid to sit with discomfort as an organization and to keep listening to lived experiences, and recognize that by trying to rationalize everything, it doesn't make the issue disappear. And organizations love jumping to immediate solutions or thinking, oh, we've done this, just apply this model to it and it'll go away. We see this a lot, or I have seen this a lot when it comes to gender versus race initiatives or gender versus disability initiatives. And woe betide anyone who is female, disabled, and defines as global majority, because we are not singular identity facets. We are complex, we're people. So there are many times, and there's one particular higher education organization that I won't name, but I really think are quite terrible in what they have done and trying to apply a gender program for upper middle class senior white women to global majority staff in all levels, and it just doesn't work. It's a failed concept. So this idea of jumping to immediate solutions and thinking, oh, well, we've done this in the past, it's going to work for this group of people, it certainly doesn't mean it's going to work in the present or in the future. And then thirdly, as a society, we need to have a culture of upstanders where people are able to challenge behaviors professionally and openly in a spirit of learning and improvement, rather than pushing back and going into culture wars and anti-wokeness and all this language that I just find so problematic, but by constantly working towards an anti-racist culture. And of course, by working towards an anti-racist culture, we're also working towards an anti-ableist culture. There's lots to it when you improve things for one group of people and you have this kind of at the heart and center of things around inclusion in a really meaningful way and dismantling barriers for people. It actually helps most people. So based on the book, there are ways in which we can see or indeed not see the faces of racism. And I'm going to pick up on a few. There are a few more in the book that he does talk about, but I just wanted to pick up on these. And I've adapted some of the definitions. So each chapter has a particular theme to it, and he defines it in terms of racism and anti-racism. And I'm just going to define it in terms of the racist side, how that's expressed. And of course, if you want to know more, you will definitely have to read the book. But I think some of the things I like to pick up on, and I've reworded them so they make more sense in the UK context, but they're definitely from his book, and I've adapted them. But is to help us make sense of all the different faces that we see of racism. So first of all, we have the systemic. So these are the policies, procedures, and practices that perpetuate the difference between races so as to create a hierarchy that is embedded in society, which is absolutely what we see. We often refer to it in the UK as institutional racism. Again, that term seems to irritate a lot of people, but it's sadly well and alive. There isn't a week, I don't think, that goes by where we don't read something in the press. So recently we had news about doctors, so Black and Asian doctors facing fitness to practice cases. We saw this story about Great Ormond Street Hospital and the cleaning staff who were outsourced, the cleaning and the porter staff who were outsourced. Many of those were global majority staff, and the way they were treated, and they didn't have access to NHS contracts and the rights that NHS workers are given. That's one example. Biological, so this idea that races are meaningfully different in their biology and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. So if we think about experiments that were done horrifically on Black women, and this idea around Black people experiencing pain differently, which is utter nonsense. We're humans, and the genetic expression of how we appear, so our phenotype and our casing, i.e. our skin color, might be different, but of course our bodies work in exactly the same way. Bodily, so this is about perceptions around certain bodies being more animal-like, violent, weak, and or less attractive than others based on skin color. So we see this in the media all the time, and reporting and photos and fashion industry, the very limited diversity we have in the fashion world. And I know it's better than it used to be, but whose bodies are valued, whose bodies are appreciated, etc. Behavioral, making individuals responsible for perceived behaviors of groups and making certain groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. Again, we see this a lot in the media. We've seen it in the UK with grooming gangs. Now, I want to be very clear here and say that, of course, those gangs of men, and there have been men, mainly men, majority men, abusing and putting young women through horrific experiences absolutely need to be held to account. What's then problematic is if other individuals who fit this stereotype or the same profile are essentially labelled in a way that is not the correct way for them to be labelled. They haven't perpetrated these crimes, as one example. Colorism, so policies, practices, and actions that lead to inequality between light and dark-skinned people. And we very much see that in an intercultural sense. So do check out my episode on tackling anti-Blackness in South Asian communities, where I talk extensively about the history of colorism, particularly in South Asian communities. Class, the impact that class has on the racial experience, and keeping classes suppressed based on poverty and skin colour. A huge challenge in the UK. And we do see the media pitting groups that would define as working class against each other from different races. And of course, we need to address socioeconomic status more than ever in terms of people's ability to be able to afford basic things. And the terminology around class, I still find very, very uncomfortable. And how we need to explore that and uncover it and understand that there will still be differences for people, but there might be also more commonalities for people within a particular quote unquote social class. Space, so resource inequity between spaces or the elimination of spaces required by certain cultures or groups or people to feel safe. And we see people's spaces getting taken away all the time. We're thinking about community spaces in the UK, or buildings being knocked down without there being the proper information given, or that the grapple to find a space once people have, even if they have been given sufficient notice, and that becomes very challenging. Gender, so policies and practices that lead to inequity between genders of various cultures and races, substantiated by racist ideas. LGBTQIA+, so inequality created on the basis of race and sexual orientation, substantiated by racist ideas. And I do see this. I mean, we have Black Pride in the UK, and then there's the Pride London, and there has to be a space for Black Pride because of I don't know the whole ins and outs of it, but the sort of importance of Black Pride and why it needs to be there. So if you want to read more about that, I will put a link in the show notes. And of course, we could also talk about disabled, the policies and practices and procedures of the disability civil movement and the inequity there around who gets seen in the disability movement. And so if we start to think about these policies, practices, and procedures and actions and how people fall into this, and this is what this book really talks about, is we have to challenge the systems. It's not about saying this person is bad, but that the systems enable certain people to have more barriers, less barriers, enables, there's a whole chapter about power in this book, which again is very, very illuminating. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and want to keep up to date. Then please join my bi-monthly newsletter. When you sign up, you'll receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And the link is bit.ly/MHLMEBK21. And the link is also in the show notes. So in this book, Ibram X. Kendi defines an anti-racist as one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. It is also about the idea that racial groups are equal and none and no one needs developing, so supporting policy that reduces racial inequality. I think as well, the idea he talks about very early on in the book, this idea of a dueling consciousness is incredibly useful, and this good-bad binary and why it's so unhelpful. And we all do things out of alignment with who we think we are. We have a responsibility to take back and reflect. So some more definitions that I think are useful. One, he talks about the assimilationist. So one who is expressing the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviorally inferior and is supporting cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop that racial group. And to me, that's very much around colonialism and empire. I read that definition and I think about the things that happened in India. I think about the workers who built the Peak Tram in Hong Kong. I think about the way the Mau Mau were treated. And I don't even know, I'm not saying I know every bit of history at all, but I think about all that and that assimilationist. And there's also, some interesting examples around dueling consciousness and whiteness of the slave owner and the missionary, which is incredibly enlightening. He also defines the segregationist. So this is one who is expressing the racist idea that a permanently inferior racial group can never be developed and is supporting a policy that segregates away that racial group. So of course, we've seen that in America and in South Africa as two key examples, and the horrific signs of drinking fountains labelled in a particular way or beaches labelled in a particular way. So it is by understanding these definitions, I think, and understanding the history that we can start to then develop this knowledge. And I think this is why this book is so useful and insights into how these policies, practices, and procedures are so strong and they hold us in this way. Much like patriarchy, we are all entrenched in patriarchy in some way. There are very few cultures that are a matriarchal system, and this sort of pushback around it and why it's so difficult. And towards the end of the book, he talks about, there's a very, very powerful bit that I don't want to read actually, because I feel that if you do want to know, you should read the book, and it does blow you away. It's very, very profound. But some of the key steps that we can all take to eliminate racial inequity in our spaces. And this is again based on this idea of, he says, we need to admit that racial inequity is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. And that it has to be looked at through an intersectional lens and all the manifestations, so that we are not just one facet. We have our gender, we have our disability, we have our sexual orientation, we have our age, we have our lived experiences, etc. To investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequity. And that can be at a departmental level, an organizational level, society, governmental level. You could choose your level, really. Invent or find anti-racist policy that can eliminate racial inequity. So there's always good practice, and there's always an opportunity to do things differently. To understand who or which group has the power to institute anti-racist policy. Now, that can be incredibly difficult within organizations and gatekeepers. And I think one of the key problems with this kind of work is that we're effectively asking people to change their worldview. And a very helpful delegate talked to me about this in a session this week. And she said, when we change language, we're actually asking people to change their worldview. So if we say to someone, don't say this, say this, it's incredibly confronting, because what we're saying is your worldview is wrong. Everything that you hold true is kind of weird and wrong. So change it. And actually, we have to take people on a journey, which takes time, and we have to explain things. And I think this is often where this pushback has come from with, oh, you can't say anything anymore. Actually, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying is that not everyone has the same world lens as us. So another example I always get pushback on, this isn't related to race, but I think can be a helpful analogy, is, oh, you can't say mum and dad anymore. I say, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're in a museum setting or a visitor setting, and you have a room full of pupils, you're doing a school session, we don't know which of those pupils, maybe from a single parent family, maybe as in a process of being adopted, maybe is a looked after pupil, maybe is been looked after by a sibling. We just don't know. So the advice is to say, right, there's some forms to sign, give it to your grown up or give it to your responsible adult, because we don't know that everyone does have a mum and a dad, do we? For various reasons. Families can look differently. So I'm not trying to take anyone's role of being a parent away, but what I am saying is that we don't know that those pupils in the room have had the same experiences we have. And very rarely are families kind of that ideal nuclear picture. And even when there were things going on under the surface that were, unspeakable in many instances. So again, relating that to pushing people's worldview can be really, really hard. Then working with sympathetic anti-racist policymakers to disseminate anti-racist policies and practice. Again, that goes back to allyship and/or coalition. So that's a whole other topic in and of itself. But then trying to think about power and how we devolve powers from policymakers that have always been at the helm to a more shared power structure. Then monitoring these anti-racist policies to see how they're working and to see if they do reduce and eliminate racial inequity. And of course, when policies and things go wrong, it's not about blaming the people. It's to start over and seek out new and more effective anti-racist ways of doing things until they work. And to monitor closely to prevent new racist policies from being changed or not being implemented. So there are lots of ideas in here, and I've just provided a snapshot. But, this book, from an academic, as you can imagine, is grounded in a lot of research, reading personal insights and interactions with people. And I think this is why, because it's so personal in nature, it wakes you up to the change and wanting to be a better human. And this journey, and it is a journey, and it's not easy. He talks about his own journey at the beginning of changing on the different roads and getting onto that dirt track. And even those of us who define as global majority, we go on a journey. It's not easy due to the structures that have been set up and we seem to be bound by as a society. But that's, of course, not to say we can't change them. But to ask someone to change overnight is not a quick or easy thing. And remember the point I made about discomfort. And I didn't want to call this episode a review because I do feel a bit like, gosh, who am I to review this amazing book? And I know I'm not saying that the other books I've reviewed aren't amazing, because they are, but there's something very special and actually quite magical about this book. And I think that everyone can benefit from reading or listening to this book, especially those of us who are practitioners, actually. I think it's a very life-changing book, but please be ready for a shake-up. And for anyone who's still feeling stuck or thinks, oh, haven't we done Black Lives Matter? Well, this will help you to get unstuck and to comprehend what anti-racism really is. And it's the ideal book for you to help you galvanize you on your journey. So I'd love to know, have you read this book? Please, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can message me on social media. You can connect with me. You can send me an email. And if you've enjoyed the show, please, why not leave me a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And I look forward to you joining me in the next episode for the last in the series for Black History Month, Action, Not Words. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.